Chapter 1. The Self. Even as a child, evangelists often said that God had a plan for my life, but I could never have fathomed what was to come. I preached the gospel at a small church when I was around 7 or 8 years old because the pastor thought I spoke well. She would often call me to the pulpit when her sermon was complete to entertain the congregation before dismissing service. To this day, I can hear her voice cheering me on as I freestyled the Word of God. Around age 10, I began lining my younger cousins up on the porch to pretend to preach. We played church like other kids played school. My mother was a devout Christian, and she raised me to love God, rebuke the devil, but above all, praise Jesus, who died for my sins. I graduated from a Jesuit university in Missouri and learned a lot about theology, philosophy, and the history of religion from the Judeo-Christian perspective. As a young adult, I never frequented church and was not a member of any congregation, but I considered myself saved and recognized Jesus as my Lord and Savior. However, I was always torn, even as a child, between faith and intellect, because some components of the Bible I would never allow myself to believe. For instance, a man who spent days in the belly of a whale, that the earth was a few thousand years old, or that two people populated a planet with different ethnicities. I was always scientifically inclined, so evolution was a fact as far as I was concerned, regardless of the book of Genesis. I became convinced that organized religion was nothing more than a business with the chief aim of profiting off humanity's lack of knowledge and innate fear of death. By the time I was 22, I was torn and agnostic at best, meaning I believed there might be a higher power somewhere, but I didn't know what it was and thought I never would. I felt if there was a God, it wasn't concerned about the destruction of the planet or humanity's future, which were things I cared about. However, that did not stop me from praying once in a while during times of fear and uncertainty. I often thought about what I believed was the oncoming destruction of the human species and whether we would perish like the dinosaurs before us. In my mind, humans were destroying the planet and ourselves without guilt. For me, Christianity was an archaic idea that I didn't believe had any place in my life, so faith in God was on the back burner as well. The idea of God was dying inside me, and I thought humans were next. I could never have imagined what would soon transpire. Before long, I would have the first supernatural experience of my life, leaving me shocked and starting a journey of enlightenment that would open my eye for an indescribable reality. But I will do my best to put it into words throughout this text. Let's start from the beginning. The moment the living God decided to shake up my worldview. I was at a large dance club in my hometown of St. Louis called Club Home. I partied a lot at that time in my life and had been drinking. I was at an all-white themed party and I was in all-white attire. I was at the club with others but found myself alone in a room separated from the more massive party, yet still surrounded by dozens of people, mostly dressed in white. I stood at a sidebar with a large mirror in back of it. The club was gigantic and had many bars, so there wasn't a bartender present at this particular one. I walked to the bar and set my drink on the counter with my back facing the bar and began people watching. For some reason, unknown today, I turned around to face the unsupervised bar and looked in the mirror and saw my reflection. However, there were no people in sight. Only darkness and smoke behind me combined with an extraordinary vibration throughout my body. As I focused on the mirror, I noticed that the entire room was empty. All I could see was my reflection in a pitch black background. I was frightened immediately and turned around abruptly to make sure that all the people were still there partying, and they were. Slowly, I looked back in the mirror again, and I was still alone in the dark, smoke filled room. I kept looking in the mirror, then behind me, over and over again, until I left the club suddenly and walked to a restaurant in the same building, petrified by what had taken place. I called my girlfriend, who is now my wife, and cried over the phone, wondering what had happened and what was next. I knew I wasn't hallucinating, but couldn't make sense of what had taken place. I didn't know what to make of the experience, but I was open to searching. Although I was confused, I was sure that the vibration was the presence of something much larger than myself. That night, God hijacked my worldview, and the symbolic cup of I know it all was emptied. Not too long after that experience, an acquaintance introduced me to New Age philosophy and the law of attraction, specifically a book called The Master Key System by Charles F. Hannell that set me on a new course, literally. The stories and myths about the Master Key System and the book's infamy make it legendary. I was puzzled because I had never heard of the book, even though the author is from my hometown, and some of the most influential people over the past century reference it, such as Napoleon Hill. The latter says it's the foundation of his teachings. The Master Key System and movies like The Secret introduced me to a new way of thinking and existing that coupled faith with science or universal law. Coming from humble beginnings, the idea that I could create wealth or control my future through a controlled system was incredible. The more I studied and researched this knowledge's origin, the more it convinced me that I had found the truth. I started meditating, thinking positive, and hoping to manifest destiny beyond my wildest imagination through thought alone, primarily based on the law of attraction. To say I drank the Kool-Aid of The Secret might be an understatement. I was making the Kool-Aid, meaning I ultimately bought in and was reading New Age books, watching documentaries, researching particle physics, and would tell anyone that would listen that our minds determined our reality. I became obsessed with this knowledge and embraced a new dogma that gave me faith again. Then I read the first chapter of Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now, entitled, You Are Not the Mind, and my worldview was flipped inside out again because I knew it was the truth without doubt. After reading that chapter, I realized that much of what I learned and experienced was to prepare me for that moment. Before acquiring this book, I was having small experiences of synchronicity, was led by signs and symbols, and knew that I was interacting with the universe in some capacity. Still, I did not have an intimate or personal relationship with God yet. I believe I was under the impression that I was attracting the truth rather than being led to it. But that misinterpretation of reality would not last long. Someone might easily mistake God's guidance for universal laws like karma, cause and effect, or attraction in the early stages of a spiritual journey. The Bible states, "Many have been called, but few are chosen by the Most High." While reading that book, God revealed through countless supernatural phenomena that my future was to become a vessel of truth. Supernatural experiences can be overwhelming to the untrained. It feels like the mind is being taken over by aliens when the infinite starts the process of calling you to serve. I suppose I associated the events with aliens because my mother taught me that Satan inherited the earth, and I didn't expect to encounter God until death. Even so, when God initiates your awareness of her existence, it can be frightening, but innately you feel that it's harmless. So you should expect that you will be afraid initially, but the thought that you are interacting with an evil force will not persist. The mind is fearful of what's happening at first, but very quickly it becomes natural. Before reading The Power of Now and having direct communication with God, I had been meditating and trying to think positively for an extended period. You can observe and analyze your thoughts more easily in meditation due to the mind's silence and stillness. I noticed very early on my spiritual journey that the mind had an affinity for chaos and seemed to be working against me. As I began to attempt to retrain my mind to think positive and manifest positive outcomes, I realized that the mind perceived fear, desire, and the possibility of negativity frequently. In the beginning, I tried to rationalize the inner workings of thought processes with logic. I believed that being afraid of the unknown resulted from evolution or natural selection for human survival from danger. But after reading The Power of Now, I was no longer positive that this was the case. I set out on a task to challenge, understand, and change the way my mind worked. At the time, my primary motivation was the attainment of wealth. I believed that it didn't matter if I meditated twice a day for 15 to 20 minutes to manifest my reality. If the other 23 hours and 30 minutes a day, I felt stressed, angry, anxious, impulsive, and was craving or afraid. My primary fears were death, poverty, and failure. Ridding myself of fear-based internal dialogue forever became my ultimate aim. I was hoping to rid myself of any negative thoughts and pondered what I could do to challenge experiencing fearful thoughts in real time. Through intuition or critical thinking, I began taking long walks at night alone through dark alleys in sketchy neighborhoods. I suggest anyone interested in studying the mind to go for a walk at night in a place believed to be the least bit frightening. I had the confidence to go on these seemingly life-threatening walks because I knew from experience that God was with me for every step along the way. I felt that if God was with me, then I had nothing to be afraid of. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, was my attitude. Nonetheless, I was astonished and captivated by the inner workings of my mind immediately. Initially, I was consumed with fear when walking through alleys of rough and drug-infested neighborhoods of West St. Louis. When I would set out on these walks, it wasn't the fear associated with anything or anyone that existed that disturbed me. It was the internal thoughts and feelings I experienced from pictures in my mind. The mind was overwhelmed with fear of what might happen instead of what existed. For instance, I feared possums as a child. So behind trash cans or when I heard a noise, I would see mental pictures of possums. When you observe thoughts, daydream, or engage in thinking tangents, there may be mental pictures that correlate with the story in your head. I refer to these mental pictures as illusions because they are not based in reality, but are a fictional picture show or illustration corresponding to the mind's false narrative. I would be walking and imagining being murdered, tortured, kidnapped, or getting attacked by some unknown person or animal. I was so fascinated by the fearful thoughts coupled with the mental illustrations that I began to go on these long walks at night a few times a week. I was never hurt or came into the slightest bit of danger, but something was always trying to convince me that I was in harm's way. In the beginning, the fearful thoughts and illusions were so captivating that I would experience stress and anxiety walking through peaceful, dark alleyways because of the misperceived harm that awaited me. These walks became something like a case study or scientific experiment on my mental processes' inner workings. I was intrigued because even when there wasn't a man or woman in sight, I imagined murderers in dark spaces. Even in silence, sometimes I pondered possums, dogs, or raccoons hidden. I became somewhat obsessed with these mirages and why my mind worked this way. I quickly realized that visualizing negativity and internalizing fear of things that weren't real was not exclusive to dark alleys or unfamiliar neighborhoods. Soon I would confirm that something was creating these false, fear-based scenarios and outcomes all the time. In all facets of my life, the mind experienced degrees of fear, stress, and anxiety based on assumptions or anticipation of the unknown. At work or in my relationship, I would try to focus on manifesting positive outcomes, but still found myself thinking or daydreaming about the what if. The what if was negative more times than not. When driving, I noticed thoughts of the possibility of car accidents. When flying, there could be a plane crash. My faithful girlfriend could be cheating. My healthy mother might get sick. A business deal I was working on might go south, and so on. It wasn't that these thoughts and illusions caused me much stress or anxiety. On the contrary, I realized that these negative, fear-based assumptions were like second nature, a chronic, harmful, and unnecessary function of mental processes. Although I was meditating faithfully and thinking positive as much as I could, staying in the now, always, or accepting the moment so that I could feel good was next to impossible. I realized that meditating in motion or keeping the mind silent was invaluable and initiated the actions that would become the foundation of this book and my future. Forgive me if I paint a picture of a sad or depressed existence at the time because my life was the furthest thing from it. In reality, I was incredibly fortunate with all things considered. I was young, gifted, joyous, gainfully employed, and lived what I thought of as a rock star lifestyle. However, when I wasn't contemplating the what if this happened, fear-based future, I was in a place of perpetual desire, thinking about how much better my life could be with more things. I refer to it as the what if I had mind state. Although I wanted to be faithful, I would desire attractive new women. I had a nice car but needed a better one. I had a lovely apartment but needed a bigger one. I had a good paying sales job but would not allow myself to be satisfied with life as it stood. These moments were before social media became a primary function of desire. I was limited to daydreams about things I saw on television, knew of but couldn't do, or hadn't been able to manifest. I realized that desire, expressions of instant gratification, and fear of the unknown dominated my mental processes. Despite being committed to meditation and focusing on positive outcomes, I felt like I had to take control of thought and emotion to create my future. I often thought about how frequently I made baseless assumptions and realized that I had a habit of believing them without evidence. I decided that my definition of insanity was to accept mental assumptions without proof. I saw that something often filled the mind with false and malicious beliefs, and I felt that I could not continue living that way. Besides, negative thoughts would trigger anxiety and stress, while positive thoughts created desire and craving. And I knew that this was counterproductive to taking control of the moment. Logically, I thought it was irrational to be physically influenced by anything, whether by way of desire or fear, if I had never experienced it in real life. But the emotional energy seemed to be independent of my logic. At this time, I was still unsure about the origin or cause of the false assumptions. However, I knew that they were a hindrance to manifesting the life I wanted due to my understanding of the law of attraction. The same is true today. If you think perpetually, false and malicious assumptions may be the viewpoint you perceive the world through. If you are making decisions with conditioned, instinctual, or habitual beliefs, there is an error if negative assumptions consume you. It's arguable that since no two moments, people, or situations are identical, making current decisions based on past experiences or beliefs exclusively is harmful or illogical. The fact is, many people automatically believe their assumptions instantly with little to no discretion. Assumptions often drive their emotions and determine how they think and feel, regardless of the reality outside of the mind. Whether negative or positive, I decided to allow questionable assumptions to drive my mentality was too consequential when attempting to attract my destiny. I realized fear or desire usually stimulated my assumptions, and I wanted to figure out how to get rid of them all. Desire is different from fear because of the belief that attaining more money or things is freedom from suffering. So many associate desire with ambition. Poor people want to be rich, and rich people want to be richer for security or to buy more things. Many poor individuals believe that attaining wealth will eliminate pain, and some of the affluent believe that more money will give them more power. Both ideas are accurate to a degree, but never fully. Moreover, wanting or acquiring things will never create lasting happiness, and that's what all are genuinely desiring. A mind consumed with desire isn't as harmful as fear, but it is still a burden. One can think of anxiety and craving as different degrees of fear or desire. The human brain can experience a chronic stress response from mental illustrations associated with attaining things, desire, fear, and assumptions. My objective was to think positively and feel good all the time. So I set out to remove those mental experiences. I wanted to harness and control my emotional and vibrational energy. So a mind focused on desire was just as harmful as fear. I found that the stress response was just as prevalent when thinking about not having the things that I perceived would make me feel good as it was when I thought about the things that I believed would make me feel bad. In both scenarios, I was creating discomfort with the reality of the moment. I felt trapped in a disillusioned world of what if mind movies starring my favorite characters. I refer to these mind movies as illusions because that's what they were, mental motion pictures. At that time, I would see images in my mind, giving illustration to these assumptions. I felt like those mind movies were equivalent to the intentional visualization exercises I did in meditation, directly affecting the creation or manifestation process by attracting the events I did not intend to come to pass. At this point, to say I was psychoanalyzing myself or preoccupied with observing the mind is to put it lightly. My insecurities, regrets, guilt, bad habits, and issues were at the forefront of my consciousness. The mental assumption that bothered me most was when I often thought I knew what other people were thinking. Most of the time, I was imagining they were thinking about me. Sometimes I imagined their thoughts were positive, and sometimes they were negative, depending on how I felt about myself at the time. However, every time I was projecting internal ideas about myself onto their thoughts. If I felt insecure, I projected my insecurities. But I assumed they were thinking positive thoughts about me when I was confident. It didn't matter if they were strangers or people close to me. I would determine I knew what they were thinking about me. The closer the person was to me, or the more I cared about their opinion, the more my ideas of what they were thinking affected my emotions. Regardless, I decided that these were disillusioned assumptions, and I had to stop thinking this way. I realized these people were not thinking about me at all. They were probably thinking about themselves, but that didn't prevent the mind from creating these projections. I also noticed that the more I analyzed the nature, origin, and quality of my thoughts, the more internal dialogue seemed reality based than when I was not actively attentive or daydreaming. I realized that since I could manipulate the mind at will and didn't do or say everything I thought of, I was undoubtedly separate from the mind and decided to change it for good. At some point, I came up with a slogan that I use to this day. It is, "You are not the mind, you are what's listening to it," because you can't be something you change. I found myself at a crossroads. I could not go on living the way I had, but I knew of no other way. After all, I was afraid of losing myself. And although we all know we can change the mind, I had no idea how to stop thinking permanently. I knew I had to eliminate the internal dialogue that seemed to be automatic or as casual as reflexes, but didn't know where to begin. Thankfully, God would mold, transform, and guide my evolution as I worked to change myself. If I had learned anything from meditation, it was that thought in and of itself was a choice. I had got pretty good at clearing my head for 15 to 20 minutes twice a day, or focusing on a single idea for an extended period. I decided that I'd become a monk and try to meditate forever or keep my mind clear at all times to get rid of the assumptions. The attainment of wealth was still critical, and I believed harnessing positive energy through positive thought was necessary for positive outcomes. So money was a primary motivating factor. Nonetheless, I also thought that eliminating stress, anxiety, and a peace of mind was attainable. The blissful state of being that I had read of and experienced for extended moments at a time became as crucial as getting rich. I used every opportunity to do what I call stay woke. If my mind floated off and began to daydream, visualize, or make noise, I would bring it back to what existed, the current moment. I would drive with the windows down to listen to the sound of cars. While waiting at stoplights, I would stare at flowers, yard signs, or anything in my line of sight to pay attention to reality and what existed outside of my head. I never really listened to music much, so I didn't have to give that up. But I watched less TV and read more. The key was to concentrate on every breath that I took while inhaling and exhaling with the nose. Later on, I would incorporate other things that would assist me, such as holding small objects or keeping my thumb and index finger joined. That alone was worth its weight in gold to stay woke. If I was lost in thought, daydreaming in the world of illusions, watching mind movies, listening to assumptions of fear or desire, or allowing my mind to go on tangents of internal dialogue, I considered myself asleep. When I sought a silent mind, proactively thought things into existence, or was in tune with the actual reality outside of my head, I felt woke. I would still go on walks, but not just at night. I would go on walks at different times a day, often, and concentrate on the sound of nature, whether birds, insects, or airplanes. I would do my best to focus on anything that was in reality and could keep me out of the inner world of illusions. It took a lot of effort at first, but the brain adapted with practice. I compare it to working out or going to the gym. Over time, staying woke became more natural as my mental muscle grew accustomed to it through the mental equivalent of muscle memory. Mental muscle memory is the training, exercise, and hardwiring that the brain will undergo. However, most people do not intentionally determine how their minds function. It's not just determined by what you think, but the practice of disciplining the mind and intentionally structuring mental processes. Like physical muscles, when you begin to build mental strength or reconfigure neurological pathways purposefully, the results are somewhat permanent. It is possible that you can lose the progress you've made and might find yourself out of shape mentally, but you will reserve some mental power. So it will always be more comfortable to start working the mind out again if you stop mental exercises. The process of eliminating perpetual thought was not only a choice, but more manageable than I could have ever imagined at the outset. When I would go back to the old way of engaging with thought during times of pressure or conversations, I felt weak and insignificant. When I was in tune with reality and woke, I relaxed on demand and didn't let fear or desire create stress. I felt empowered and free. Within about 7 months, I found myself able to silence the mind on demand. For example, during a business meeting with a potential client, in real time, I'd be thinking things like, you will want to sign this contract, or you will want to do business with me. As the individual was speaking, I could concentrate and focus while others were talking because I wasn't thinking when they were speaking. At the time, I wasn't sure if I was affecting the causality of the individual I was speaking with, but understood that I was manipulating and motivating my actions and feelings to influence the situation. Also, staying woke made conversations and human interaction easier because I could listen and process information without being inundated with my thoughts and assumptions about myself or their words. The world became a much more interesting place as I spent time outside of illusions and assumptions. I grew closer to God and realized that God was everywhere and a part of everything. Synchronicity, signs, and symbols to guide and instruct my decisions became constant. The more silent my mind was, and the more I was in tune with the world outside of my head, the more I noticed the hand of God steering me towards her will. Also, as I took control of my internal mental processes, the easier it became for me to access and interpret life through the spiritual realm. I lived alone at the time and would sit in silence and darkness for long periods. During moments of silence, I found that it's easier to keep the mind quiet when focused on two things at once. So I would focus on breathing with the nose while keeping my thumb and middle finger connected to stay awake. Hearing birds communicate, watching squirrels play, observing ants hunt, or spider making webs took on a more beautiful and exciting role than I could have ever imagined before. When you are asleep or listening to internal dialogue, your attention is on everything except what exists at that moment. There's always peace, gratitude, or beauty in reality. When you're awake, you can imagine something worse than your current circumstances, which can be calming. When lost in perpetual thought, you are thinking of something that does not exist, and it produces degrees of fear or desire. Within about 7 months, I was able to change my thought system with relative ease. I no longer saw illusions or would float off onto mental tangents or daydreams all the time. I would still conjure up fear and desire, but I observed thought without being as emotionally attached to it. Embarking on a spiritual journey is difficult to put into words, but here you go. In the darkness and silence, you can find and then know thyself. When you cut yourself off from the sensory world, you discover who and what you truly are. No one is the mind. We are all what's listening to it. Unfortunately, you all learned that being on a hamster wheel of constant cognitive activity is normal because everyone around you is too. In reality, for most people, stress and anxiety are all derivatives of fear and associated with perpetually thinking about what if this happens, not real life experiences. Pressure, Craving for instant gratification and continuous wanting are all derivatives of desire and the underlying state of what if I had that comes with continual mental activity. Mental silence gets you closer to peace and a pivotal component to living in harmony and gratitude regardless of circumstance. More importantly, it was in the darkness and silence with an empty mind that I met myself and God. As I stated, spiritual experiences are kin to an out-of-body experience. When you leave the lower mind and enter the spiritual realm, it feels like something foreign entered your mental space, but that's the furthest thing from the truth. You are just experiencing the higher mind and activating the crown chakra to a higher degree. When you are in the absolute and identify as a spiritual being, you confront your true nature outside of time and space. These spiritual experiences started happening daily while meditating. In the silence, I was able to disconnect from the outside world of sensory perception and met the real me. In the darkness, you realize without a doubt that you are not the body or the mind, and that death is an illusion as well. You are the only thing that has ever been, a divine and immortal spiritual being, a derivative of God and made in her likeness. John 4:13 from the Bible says, "Hereby know we that dwell in him, and he in us, because he hath given us of his Spirit." The idea of being created in God's image took on a new meaning for me. The purpose of the biblical story of Adam and Eve was clear, because it was about humanity's separation from the spiritual realm with God and living as spiritual beings to existing as a beast. When they bit from the symbolic tree of knowledge and took on identity or individuality, they also got greed, selfishness, desire, and so on. But the most harmful seed in the apple was fear. When you connect to God through mental silence, you can work to carry out God's will and heal the world. Before biting the figurative apple of I know, Adam and Eve lived in harmony and free of constant thought, fear, desire, worry, guilt, regret, and all other mental phenomena resulting from existing in separation or God not leading this life experience. Living as monks do, keeping the mind silent, is closer to our true nature and the ultimate spiritual warfare or path of enlightenment. The allegorical story of Adam and Eve is an analogy about humanity beginning to entertain individuality and allowing free will to disconnect them from the mind of God or heaven, which is pure love, and entered the hell of human experience stimulated by the belief in time, space, and limitation. The reality is that you are not a man or woman. You are a spiritual being. Your true nature is simply the most complicated thing you can imagine. You are God. God is all that there is, all that has ever been, and all that will ever be. The Alpha and Omega, beginning and end, first and last. All minds are within God's mind, and all beings are within the highest being. we will exist within her for eternity. We know that time is relative and is a function of perception. Our bodies appear to age over the years, but the cells that are forming are brand new. Everything in the universe is identical, with the microscope strong enough to see atoms. Humans have never created or destroyed energy. So whether water, ice, or vapor, it's all the same with a different molecular structure. God created time and space so that you could experience the perception of individuality. But in the lowest common denominator, at your core, you are what has always been. The human experience is a dream. Eternity is a tool to awaken the spiritual being to its true nature. To know the self and set out on a journey of enlightenment is not without trial or tribulation. You still live in a world influenced by the adversary. However, you must have a relationship with God to find the peace and freedom that can only be found on a path within, because it is a journey of self-realization. I define enlightenment as having a personal relationship with the all-knowing creator of the universe and knowing God exists without any doubt. In this book, I'll try to provide detail of my experiences along with tools to assist in your atonement. Our thoughts are powerful. Thought is the most divine tool God gifted the spiritual being. And up until now, the enemy weaponized the mind for our destruction. When we collectively identify as divine spiritual beings, we will be able to change our world, save our planet, and save our future. We must save us from ourselves.